Most people think the word dungeon originally meant an underground prison, but that's actually not true. It comes from the Old French term donjon, which referred to the Great Keep, or the main tower at the center of a castle. Interestingly, the French word that actually means dungeon is cachot. Back in medieval times, the central keep, also called the donjon, was usually the strongest and most heavily fortified part of the entire castle. Massive stone walls surrounded it, and because it had very few windows, it eventually became an ideal place to hold prisoners. During the 11th century, most castle keeps were built with a square design. However, things began to change in the 12th century when armies started using battering rams that could seriously damage those flat walls. As a result, builders switched to round towers because their curved shape made them much harder to break through during an attack. Since the keep was the safest place inside the castle, it served an important purpose in the early Middle Ages. The lord of the castle and the people closest to him lived there, and if enemy forces managed to capture the outer defenses, they could retreat into the keep as their last line of protection. As time went on, though, the role of the keep slowly changed. Instead of serving only as a place of refuge, it also became the most secure location for protecting valuable treasures and holding important prisoners whose escape simply couldn't be risked. Eventually, the meaning of the word dungeon expanded. It came to describe almost any prison located inside a castle, although people most often used it when talking about the underground cells. Even though those basement chambers weren't originally built to lock people away, they turned out to be nearly perfect for that purpose. In the early medieval period, imprisonment wasn't the usual punishment for crimes. More often than not, criminals were fined, mutilated, or executed instead. Keeping someone locked up for a long time simply wasn't considered practical. Still, during times of war and political unrest, there were exceptions. Powerful nobles, military leaders, and other important figures were sometimes taken captive because they could be used as bargaining chips during negotiations or exchanged for valuable concessions. Even then, only prisoners of great importance were usually kept alive and held for extended periods. Ordinary criminals weren't considered worth the money, effort, or resources it took to feed and guard them. Today, we're going to take a trip back through history and explore one of the most horrifying forms of medieval imprisonment ever created, the Oubliette, a place associated with suffering so terrible that it's almost beyond imagination. I'm looking at a castle that became infamous for its enormous network of dark, oppressive dungeons. Built during the 9th century, Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, England, was once an impressive fortress, but over the centuries it gained a reputation for violence, suffering, and death. In 1311, King Edward II locked up his cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, along with 20 other rebels inside the castle's dungeons before they were eventually executed. Years later, in 1399, another king met a tragic fate within those same walls. After Richard II surrendered to Henry Bolingbroke, he was secretly transported from the Tower of London to Pontefract Castle in the north of England. Historians believe he was confined in a tiny dungeon beneath the castle's keep, where he sat alone in cold, damp darkness. No one knows for certain exactly how he died. Some believe he was murdered, while others think he was deliberately left to starve. Either way, Richard died on St. Valentine's Day in the year 1400, when he was only 33 years old, clearing the path for Bolingbroke to take the throne as King Henry IV. Many years afterward, during the final stages of the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the victorious parliamentarian forces, developed a deep hatred for Pontefract Castle. Since it was the last royalist fortress to surrender, he wanted it erased completely. To make that happen, he encouraged the people of Pontefract to petition Parliament and demand that the castle be destroyed. The townspeople were more than willing to support Cromwell's plan. To them, the castle represented years of misery and destruction. Time after time, soldiers marching toward the fortress had looted their homes, murdered their men, and committed terrible acts of violence against their women. The castle had become a symbol of their suffering. Cromwell's efforts were successful, and in 1649 the demolition of Pontefract Castle officially began. Even today, the ruins of Pontefract Castle still stand as a reminder of its brutal past. Hidden beneath what remains of its once mighty curtain wall, about 35 feet below the ground, lie the dark and depressing dungeons where countless prisoners were once confined. Another castle with an equally terrifying history is Chillingham Castle. Long before it became a fortress, it began as a monastery. Its location on the border between England and Scotland made it strategically important during centuries of conflict between the two nations. In 1246, King Henry III granted the manor house to the Grey family. Nearly a century later, in 1344, King Edward III ordered the property to be transformed into a heavily fortified castle. The renovations added battlements, a torture chamber, and a network of dungeons that would soon become infamous. Edward I, remembered as the ruthless Hammer of the Scots, used the dungeons at Chillingham Castle to imprison those he captured. The prisoners included not only Scottish soldiers and suspected spies, but also innocent women and children. Many captives suffered unimaginable torture before they were even thrown into their cells. Some had their arms and legs deliberately broken, and then they were dropped nearly 20 feet through a trapdoor into the dungeon below. Inside those underground chambers, almost no light could enter. Only a single narrow arrow slit pierced the thick stone walls, leaving the prisoners trapped in near total darkness. With little or no food, they were abandoned to die from starvation. Their desperation became so extreme that stories claim some prisoners eventually resorted to eating their own flesh in a final attempt to stay alive. According to local accounts, around 7,500 Scottish prisoners died at Chillingham Castle. After their deaths, it is said their bodies were simply thrown into the nearby lake, leaving behind a legacy that still haunts the castle's history. Now I'm heading to the coast of Fife, Scotland, where St. Andrew's Castle has overlooked the sea since it was first built in the late 12th century. Throughout the Scottish Wars of Independence, control of the castle changed hands several times as the Scots and the English fought for dominance, especially during the reign of King Edward I. In the castle's northwest corner stood a sea tower that served as a prison while the fortress was still in use. The upper levels weren't designed only for confinement. They also provided guest accommodations and housed noble prisoners who were being kept under a form of house arrest rather than locked away in harsh conditions. The ground floor was divided into two separate chambers. One was a small room with only a narrow ventilation slit carved into the eastern wall, allowing very little fresh air or light inside. The second chamber, however, was far more terrifying. It contained the infamous Bottle Dungeon, one of the castle's most feared prisons. Carved directly into solid rock, the Bottle Dungeon stretched about 24 feet deep. It was wide at the bottom but narrowed dramatically toward the top, giving it the shape that inspired its name. There were no windows, no real ventilation, and virtually no hope for anyone trapped inside. Prisoners were simply lowered into the pit and abandoned, left to slowly waste away in darkness. One of the unfortunate men imprisoned there was David Stewart, Duke of Rothesay, who was the heir to the Scottish throne. In 1402, he was confined inside the Bottle Dungeon, although that wasn't where he ultimately died. Instead, he was later transferred to another prison at Falkland Palace, where he was deliberately left to starve to death. Another high-ranking prisoner was Murdoch Stewart, Duke of Albany. Before being executed for treason at Stirling Castle in 1425, he was also held in the dungeons beneath St. Andrew's Castle. Sadly, the castle's prisoners weren't limited to political rivals or noblemen accused of crimes. Patrick Graham, the first Archbishop of St. Andrews, was declared insane and imprisoned there as well. Later, he was moved to Loch Leven Monastery, where he remained in confinement until his death in 1478. After looking at all these castles, it's pretty clear to me that being locked up during the Middle Ages was anything but pleasant. Wealthy nobles who were being held for ransom were often given decent rooms and treated fairly well. But for everyone else, life inside a castle prison was a nightmare. Violence was simply accepted as part of everyday life in medieval times. Torture methods, such as stretching victims on the rack until their bones broke, crushing fingers with thumb screws until the joints came apart, and branding people with red-hot irons were considered perfectly acceptable punishments. As horrifying as those methods already were, there was an even more dreadful place waiting for some prisoners, the Oubliette, also known as the Forgotten Room. For many people who were thrown into one of these pits, there would never be another chance to see daylight. An oubliette was built as a narrow, cylindrical shaft lined with stone. The space inside was so cramped that simply turning around would have been difficult, and sitting, kneeling, or lying down was often impossible. Many oubliettes were dug beneath existing dungeons, creating what was essentially a prison inside another prison. Because of their location underground, water, mud, and other filth naturally seeped into them, leaving the chamber constantly cold, damp, and miserable. Prisoners were lowered into the shaft with a rope, and once they reached the bottom, they had little choice but to remain standing in total darkness until someone decided to pull them back out. In some cases, they may have been forced to stand on the decaying remains or scattered bones of the unfortunate prisoner who had died there before them. Some captives survived for weeks because guards occasionally tossed down small amounts of food and water. Others were given nothing at all and were simply abandoned to die from starvation after only a few days. I can only imagine the overwhelming fear they must have felt as the trapdoor high above slammed shut. The opening was far beyond their reach, leaving them trapped in complete darkness with no escape and no hope. Standing in foul-smelling water with only rats crawling around them for company, those prisoners truly understood why the name Oubliette came from the French word oublier, which means to forget. These terrible prisons were used across both Europe and the Middle East. France's Bastille became especially well known for its oubliettes, and another infamous example could be found at Rumeli-Hisarlik, located in what is now modern-day Turkey. The Bastille itself was originally built to protect Paris from English attacks during the Hundred Years' War. In 1370, King Charles V of France expanded the fortress by adding 6 new towers, along with a network of dungeons beneath them. Rumeli-Hisarlik, sometimes called Throat Cutter Castle, was constructed during the mid-15th century near the side of the Bosphorus Strait. At the time, the area belonged to the Byzantine city of Constantinople, which is known today as Istanbul. Hidden on the 6th level of one of its towers was a secret doorway leading directly to a deep vertical shaft built inside the thick stone wall. An unsuspecting prisoner pushed through that opening would plunge about 13 feet to the bottom of the dark pit below. If the fall didn't kill him, it almost certainly left him badly injured, and he would simply be abandoned there to slowly die. Another notorious prison cell existed beneath the White Tower at the Tower of London. This tiny chamber measured only 4 feet by 4 feet, and became known by the cruelly ironic name Little Ease. The space was so unbelievably small that an average adult couldn't stand upright, stretch out, sit comfortably, or lie down. With no windows and almost no room to move, the prisoner was forced to crouch in complete darkness while enduring constant pain. Some remained there for days, while others suffered for weeks, being removed only when it was time for another interrogation or another round of torture. One of the most famous prisoners ever confined inside Little Ease was Guy Fawkes, who took part in the failed gunpowder plot of November 5th, 1605. Most noble prisoners were usually kept under a form of house arrest instead of being thrown into these horrifying pits. They often received private chambers, sometimes inside the castle keep, and in certain cases were even allowed to move around parts of the castle under supervision. If an important prisoner was placed inside an oubliette, it was generally only for a short period, since the experience was meant to break their spirit and force them to reveal information. Conwy Castle in Wales provides another example of this terrifying design. It was built in the 1280s by our old acquaintance, King Edward I, who wasn't satisfied with conquering Scotland and also set out to bring Wales under his control. Connected to the Great Hall is the prison tower. One chamber there may actually have been fairly comfortable if it had contained something as simple as a chair or a bed. Beneath that room, however, was the real dungeon, a pit carved roughly 12 feet into solid rock, with the only entrance being a trapdoor directly overhead. Pembroke Castle also has its own dark history. In 1440, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester and Earl of Pembroke, imprisoned John Wython inside the castle's Oubliette. Wython was stripped of his clothing and given almost nothing to eat. Left alone inside the dark, cramped shaft for an extended period, he eventually lost his eyesight and developed other permanent illnesses from which he never recovered. As horrifying as that sounds, Leek Castle in Ireland may have been even worse. Its oubliette was built with sharp spikes covering the floor, ensuring that anyone who fell inside would suffer even more. This small dungeon, located near the castle chapel, had originally been intended as a secure place to store valuables. However, during renovation work in the 1920s, workers reportedly uncovered the remains of more than 150 people inside. According to the accounts, 3 cartloads of human skeletons had to be removed from the pit. It's another chilling reminder of just how many oubliettes once existed across medieval Europe and how widely this brutal form of punishment was accepted. I release a new story every week, so if you'd like to hear more fascinating history like this, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. Thanks for listening.